The Colorado dawn was silent, too silent. A frost clung to the ranchlands, painting the ground in brittle silver. Then a sound cut through the quiet, a cry low and guttural, both fierce and desperate. It wasn't the howl of dominance wolves are known for. It was the sound of pain. This wolf would come to be known as One Ear. To most ranchers in Colorado, a wolf is a predator, an enemy. But to one farmer, what he saw in this moment wasn't a killer. It was a creature fighting for survival. Wolves had only recently been reintroduced to Colorado. Packs with names like King Mountain, Three Creeks, and One Ear roamed the high country, clashing with cattle and the people who raised them. To some, they symbolized hope for wild lands. To others, they were a threat to livelihoods. Most livestock deaths, over 86%, come from illness, weather, or accidents. Less than 1% are caused by wolves. But in the minds of many, numbers don't matter. Fear is louder than statistics. And fear was exactly what this farmer felt as he stood just feet away from the wounded predator. What should he do? Walk away and leave the wolf to die? Call the authorities and risk them putting it down? Or take the unthinkable step of helping it? This was the beginning of a story no one expected. A story not of fear, but of empathy. A story where one man's choice would challenge generations of conflict between ranchers and wolves. Long before he found the wolf, the farmer's life had been bound to the soil of Colorado. His name was Thomas Whitaker, a man whose family had worked these ranchlands for 3 generations. The Whitakers had weathered droughts, blizzards, and collapsing cattle prices. What they feared most, however, was the silent shadow of predators, wolves reintroduced after decades of absence. Colorado is a place of contrasts. To the west, towering mountains draped in snow. To the east, endless prairies where ranchers fight for survival. It is here that 3 new wolf packs emerged: King Mountain, Three Creeks, and One Ear. Each brought litters of pups into the wild, though only half survived. Life for wolves, like life for ranchers, is precarious. For Thomas, wolves were more than a headline or statistic. They were stories told by neighbors, the calf taken in the night, the tracks found near fence lines. Fear seeped into every conversation at the feed store, every late-night patrol with a rifle slung across his back. And yet beneath that fear lay something unspoken, a quiet respect. Because Thomas knew the land did not belong to him alone. The soil beneath his boots, the rivers that carved the valleys, the elk and deer that grazed at dusk, they all had claims older than his family name. Generations collide in Colorado. The young grow up hearing about conservation, about restoring what was lost. The old guard remembers only the dangers. Thomas lived caught between those worlds, between loyalty to tradition and curiosity about the wild returning to his doorstep. Across the state, debates burned hotter than summer wildfires. Some celebrated the wolves' return, saying they restored balance to fragile ecosystems. Others cursed the decision, convinced that wolves spelled ruin for ranching. It was on one of those borders where fences meet forest that Thomas's story would change forever. Thomas wasn't reckless. He knew the risks. Wolves weren't pets. They weren't characters from children's stories. They were wild, fierce, untamed, and unpredictable. But he also knew something else. The land had grown quieter since their return. Elk herds no longer overran the valleys. Coyotes shifted their ranges. A subtle balance was beginning to emerge, one that even Thomas couldn't ignore. Among these wolves was One Ear, the survivor. No one knew exactly how he lost his ear, perhaps a trap, perhaps a fight. What mattered was that he endured. The biologists who tracked him believed his pack was smaller, tougher, shaped by struggle. One Ear carried his scars into every encounter, a reminder that even the wild bends beneath hardship. Thomas's life and One Ear's fate seemed destined to clash. Neither knew it yet, but soon circumstance would force them into the same story. A story where a trap set by one man would nearly take a life, and where another man's choice would rewrite it. This was Colorado's frontier in the 21st century. Not the frontier of pioneers and wagons, but of survival and coexistence. And at its center stood a farmer and a wolf, both bound by land, both bound by fear, and soon by something unexpected. Long before he found the wolf, the farmer's life had been bound to the soil of Colorado. His name was Thomas Whitaker, a man whose family had worked these ranch lands for 3 generations. The Whitakers had weathered droughts, blizzards, and collapsing cattle prices. What they feared most, however, was the silent shadow of predators, wolves reintroduced after decades of absence. Colorado is a place of contrasts. To the west, towering mountains draped in snow. To the east, endless prairies where ranchers fight for survival. It is here that 3 new wolf packs emerged. King Mountain, 3 Creeks, and 1 Ear. Each brought litters of pups into the wild, though only half survived. Life for wolves, like life for ranchers, is precarious. For Thomas, wolves were more than a headline or statistic. They were stories told by neighbors, the calf taken in the night, the tracks found near fence lines. Fear seeped into every conversation at the feed store, every late-night patrol with a rifle slung across his back. And yet beneath that fear lay something unspoken, a quiet respect, because Thomas knew the land did not belong to him alone. The soil beneath his boots, the rivers that carved the valleys, the elk and deer that grazed at dusk, they all had claims older than his family name. Generations collide in Colorado. The young grow up hearing about conservation, about restoring what was lost. The old guard remembers only the dangers. Thomas lived caught between those worlds, between loyalty to tradition and curiosity about the wild returning to his doorstep. Across the state, debates burned hotter than summer wildfires. Some celebrated the wolves' return, saying they restored balance to fragile ecosystems. Others cursed the decision, convinced that wolves spelled ruin for ranching. It was on one of those borders where fences meet forest that Thomas's story would change forever. Thomas wasn't reckless. He knew the risks. Wolves weren't pets. They weren't characters from children's stories. They were wild, fierce, untamed, and unpredictable. But he also knew something else. The land had grown quieter since their return. Elk herds no longer overran the valleys. Coyotes shifted their ranges. A subtle balance was beginning to emerge, one that even Thomas couldn't ignore. Among these wolves was 1 Ear, the survivor. No one knew exactly how he lost his ear, perhaps a trap, perhaps a fight. What mattered was that he endured. The biologists who tracked him believed his pack was smaller, tougher, shaped by struggle. 1 Ear carried his scars into every encounter, a reminder that even the wild bends beneath hardship. Thomas's life and 1 Ear's fate seemed destined to clash. Neither knew it yet, but soon circumstance would force them into the same story. A story where a trap set by one man would nearly take a life, and where another man's choice would rewrite it. This was Colorado's frontier in the 21st century. Not the frontier of pioneers and wagons, but of survival and coexistence. And at its center stood a farmer and a wolf, both bound by land, both bound by fear, and soon by something unexpected. The wolf's journey back from the edge of death did not happen in silence. It began in the small-town clinic where Dr. Emily Ruiz worked, an unassuming building that smelled of hay, iodine, and coffee gone cold. For years, it had been the place where cattle with broken legs and horses with infected hooves came to be saved. Now, a wild wolf lay on its steel table, stitched and trembling. Thomas stood in the corner, hat in hand, watching. He had brought livestock through these doors before, but never a wolf. The sound of its labored breathing echoed louder than the hum of machines. Every instinct told him he had crossed a line. Wolves were not meant for barns or clinics. They were meant for forests, mountains, rivers. Yet here it was between life and death because of a choice he had made. The nights that followed were restless. Emily kept the wolf sedated, its paw-bandaged IV dripping slowly. Thomas returned each day, bringing raw meat approved by the wildlife officers she had notified. He fed it through the bars of the crate, always with caution, always with a tremor of fear. That first gaze nearly sent Thomas stumbling backward, but something in him held steady. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe compassion. Whatever it was, he refused to look away. It was a fragile truce. Fear on both sides, hunger binding them together. Healing was not a straight path. Some mornings the wolf refused to eat. Other nights fever raged, and Emily warned Thomas the infection might win. There were moments he believed it wouldn't make it, moments when he prepared himself for the weight of regret. And yet, each time the wolf endured. That sound filled the clinic. It raised goosebumps on Thomas's arms. It was a reminder this was no dog. This was the wilderness itself singing in a man-made room. From then on, Thomas stopped calling it the wolf. He began calling it One Ear. Emily warned him, wolves don't tame. They don't bend to leashes or fences. But Thomas insisted. If One Ear had survived this far, it deserved more than shadows and steel. Thomas kept his distance. He didn't need gratitude. He just needed the wolf to heal. Days stretched into weeks. Slowly, the wolf's paw strengthened. Its limp faded. The missing ear, once grotesque, became a badge of defiance. Then came the night Thomas nearly lost him. Relief flooded through him. He stayed by the pen all night wrapped in a blanket. Lantern flickering, whispering words meant more for himself than for the wolf. When dawn broke, One Ear stood shakily but alive, and Thomas knew the wolf wasn't the only one healing. Fear was still there, always, but alongside it grew something unexpected: respect, and in respect, the seed of trust. Thomas had once seen wolves only as threats. Now each day he saw a survivor. Each scar on One Ear's body mirrored the scars carried by the land, by the people, by himself. That moment lingered in Thomas's mind long after, because in those golden eyes he no longer saw an enemy. He saw possibility. Spring came late that year, dragging storms across Colorado like scars torn into the sky. The land thawed only to freeze again, leaving the ranch sodden, brittle, and unpredictable. By then, One Ear had regained his strength. His paw bore the memory of steel, but his stride was sure, his howl stronger. It began with a storm, a blizzard, that no forecaster had seen coming, a wall of snow that erased the horizon. For ranchers, it meant fear for their herds. For Thomas, it meant something more. The storm was not just cold, it was merciless. Power lines snapped. Fences vanished beneath drifts. The ranch, his livelihood, his legacy, teetered on the edge of ruin. And in the center of it all stood the wolf, trapped yet unbroken. Thomas's first instinct was dread. A wolf loose in a storm meant chaos. But then he saw where One Ear ran, not toward the forest, but toward the pasture. One Ear circled the herd, barking sharp guttural notes, commands born of instinct. The cattle, confused but desperate, began to cluster together, shielded from the wind by their own mass. In that moment, predator and rancher were no longer enemies. They were allies against something larger, something neither could conquer alone. The farmer's muscles burned. The wolf's breath steamed in the air. Side by side they fought the blizzard, not with words, not with trust, but with sheer will to survive. It was not gratitude in those eyes. It was something fiercer: respect, a recognition that survival, at least tonight, was shared. The walls buckled, the lantern sputtered, and for the first time, Thomas whispered what he had never dared: "I can't do this without you." That night, the wolf was not the enemy. He was the voice of the wilderness, the call that steadied Thomas's hands, the presence that turned fear into fire. When the sun rose, it revealed devastation. Fields buried, equipment ruined. But the herd survived. The family survived. And the wolf survived. For a long moment, they watched each other. No words, no promises. Just the understanding that something had shifted. The storm had taken much, but it had left something greater in its wake. A bond forged not in peace but in battle. In his heart, Thomas knew the truth. The wolf belonged to the wild. But for one night in the fury of snow and thunder, their lives had crossed in a way no law, no fear could undo. This was no longer the story of a farmer and a predator. It was the story of two survivors, each scarred, each stubborn, who proved that even in the harshest storm, coexistence was possible. The storm had passed, but the real battle was just beginning. In the quiet that followed, word spread quickly across the valley. Thomas Whitaker had sheltered, a wolf fed, it even fought a blizzard at its side. To some, it was a story of courage. To others, it was proof that Thomas had lost his mind. Lines were drawn. Old fears hardened into anger. To most ranchers, wolves were still the enemy responsible or not for the majority of livestock deaths. Facts mattered little when fear gnawed louder. He wanted to explain, to say that less than 1% of cattle deaths came from wolves, that disease and weather were the real killers. But in that room, numbers meant nothing. Stories ruled, and the story painted him as a man who sided with predators. The law was clear. Wolves were not pets. They were state-managed, federally protected. No citizen could harbor one, not even a man who had saved its life. Thomas explained the truth that the wolf had left on its own, but the officers pressed harder. Had he fed it, tended to it, kept it in captivity? Each answer edged him closer to trouble. Emily Ruiz backed him up, her medical notes precise. The wolf had been treated only to save its life, then released. Still whispers spread faster than facts. Friendships thinned into silence. Contracts for cattle sales began to dry up. To many, Thomas had betrayed the unspoken code of ranchers: protect your herd at all costs, even if it means killing the wild. Meanwhile, one ear grew stronger in the forest. Biologists tracked his movements through faint radio signals. Reports told of a pack regrouping, pups surviving, the scarred wolf at its head. Each report brought Thomas both relief and dread. Relief that the wolf lived. Dread that it might cross into his neighbor's pastures again. The boundary between survival and conflict was razor thin. The message was unmistakable. He could not protect one ear again, not without risking everything. Thomas lay awake at night listening for distant howls. Each one twisted his heart. The law said wolves were not his responsibility. His neighbors said wolves were a curse. But his conscience said otherwise. He had entered a space no rancher wanted: a gray zone between law and loyalty, between survival and compassion. And soon he would have to choose: protect his world or let it go. The letter from the Wildlife Department lingered in Thomas Whitaker's mind like a shadow. Each night, the crackle of fire reminded him of what he had burned: the warning, the threat. Yet the echo of howls beyond the ridge reminded him of something else: the bond he could no longer deny. One ear had returned once, padding silently along the fence line, not seeking food, not threatening cattle, just watching. For hours, Thomas stood with him, no barrier but distance. It was a reunion without words, without touch. And Thomas knew the wolf still remembered. The ranch was fragile. Every decision mattered: feed costs, weather patterns, market swings. Yet no number in the ledger could weigh against the question gnawing at him. What do I owe this wolf? Emily's voice echoed in his memory. He belongs to the wild. Keeping him close will only end in loss for both of you. He had made his choice. If One Ear returned, he would not chain him, not fight the law, not test fate again. He would do what was hardest, let him go. This was no surrender. It was trust. Trust that the wolf would find his way. Trust that coexistence meant distance, not possession. One Ear emerged like a ghost. Cautious, proud, scarred, but unbroken. The wolf's gait was strong now, his presence commanding. He stopped just feet away, nose twitching at the air. The wolf did not bow, did not break. He simply stood, the forest at his back. The man at his front, two survivors separated by choice. Then One Ear turned. Muscles coiled. He leapt into the trees, snow scattering beneath his paws. But before the forest swallowed him, he paused. It was not a farewell in words. It was a mark, a memory carved into the night sky. A promise that neither would forget. Loss and relief mixed inside him. He had let go not because he wanted to, but because he had to. And in that act, he had discovered something rare, the courage to respect freedom more than his own comfort. It was proof, fragile and fleeting, that their paths had crossed. Proof that coexistence is not about ownership, but about remembering when lives align. The wolf was gone. The farmer remained. But the bond between them had left a mark neither law nor distance could erase. Weeks passed, then months. Winter surrendered to spring, and the land of Colorado awoke again. Calves stumbled across fresh grass streams, roared with snowmelt, and the scars of the blizzard slowly healed. But for Thomas Whitaker, there remained a silence, a space left by the wolf he had set free. Life on the ranch pressed forward. Repairs filled Thomas's days, mending fences, restocking supplies, rebuilding what the storm had taken. His neighbors spoke little to him now, some still cold with suspicion, yet others began to soften. Whispers spread that his herd had survived the storm better than most. Relief washed over him like sunlight breaking through clouds. One Ear had not only survived, he had claimed his place as a leader in the wild. For Thomas, the news was more than science. It was proof that letting go had been the right choice. Proof that compassion did not weaken survival, it strengthened it. Memory was not measured in words or years. It lived in scars, in shared battles, in the quiet respect between two survivors. The debates in Colorado did not end. Wolves still sparked arguments in town halls and headlines. But slowly, stories like Thomas's began to ripple outward. For every neighbor who called him foolish, another began to wonder. Perhaps wolves were not only destroyers. Perhaps, sometimes they were allies. Generations were beginning to see differently. And Thomas knew that was enough. Change never arrives in a roar. It arrives in whispers. It was not a reunion in sight, but in sound. A reminder that the wolf still lived, still roamed, still called these valleys home. In that moment, the distance between man and wolf collapsed. They were connected not by fences or fear, but by survival, by land, by a story shared once and carried forever. The scarred wolf lifted his head and sang to the night, and somewhere below, a farmer listened not with dread, but with reverence. This was the true end of their story, not ownership, not defeat, but coexistence. A man and a wolf, both free, both bound to a land that asked only for respect. The story of Thomas Whitaker and One Ear is not simply about a man and a wolf. It is about choice. It is about compassion in a place where fear has ruled for generations. And it is about what happens when one act of empathy rewrites an entire narrative. For decades, wolves were cast as villains of the West, symbols of loss of livestock gone missing, of livelihoods under threat. But the truth tells another story. More than 86% of cattle deaths come from disease, weather, or accidents. Wolves. Less than 1%. Fear magnified their role, while facts were buried beneath myth. What Thomas learned, and what we can all take from his journey, is that coexistence begins not with statistics, but with perspective. When we see predators only as enemies, we close the door on balance. When we allow compassion to guide us, even once the door opens. This story is not only about saving a single animal, it is about changing how future generations understand the wild, about teaching that strength is not found in dominance, but in respect. Science confirms what Thomas felt in his bones. Ecosystems thrive when wolves return. Elk herds move forests, regrow rivers, reshape. The wolf is not the end of balance, it is its beginning. And so, one ear becomes more than a scarred survivor. He becomes a symbol of coexistence, a reminder that we share this land with forces older, wilder, and just as deserving of life as ourselves. For him, the lesson was simple but profound. Compassion is not weakness. Compassion is courage. The wild will test us, storms will come, fear will whisper. But if we choose empathy over hatred, respect over fear, then perhaps, like Thomas, we will hear the howl of the wolf not as a threat, but as a song. And that is the story of the farmer and the one-eared wolf. If this story moved you, remember wildlife needs guardians, not enemies. Support sanctuaries. Respect the wild, and most of all, subscribe for more stories.